The rain had stopped, but the mud kept the memory of it. June 9th, 1944, just outside the French village of Mesnil-Patry, Normandy. A lone Canadian soldier crouched behind a shattered hedgerow and watched through cracked binoculars as a column of German panthers crept forward. Through the morning haze, Corporal Albert Christie of the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada counted 4 tanks, maybe 5, their hulls painted in the mottled camouflage that made them disappear against the tree line until they moved. He lowered the binoculars. His hands were shaking, not from fear exactly, from the mathematics of what came next. If he did nothing, every man in his platoon would die within minutes. The calculation was simple, brutal but simple. The Panthers were advancing along the only road that offered cover from Allied artillery. His platoon was pinned in a drainage ditch 200 meters to the west, caught in the open when the ambush began. No radio contact, no tank support, no air cover. The weather had grounded reconnaissance for 3 days straight, and German positions that should have been mapped were invisible until they opened fire. 13 Canadian Shermans burned in the fields behind him. He could hear the ammunition inside them cooking off small pops like firecrackers beneath the deeper thunder of the German guns. Static hissed from a dead radio set somewhere in the ditch. Artillery echoed across the shattered landscape, but none of it was theirs. The German 88 seconds fired in methodical rhythm, walking their shells across the muddy ground where Christie's unit had been trying to advance just 20 minutes earlier. He pressed his face against the cold earth and tasted dirt and cordite and blood from where he'd bitten his lip without noticing. His platoon sergeant was dead. The lieutenant was wounded, dragged into a crater by 2 privates, who were pinned there now by machine gun fire. Christie had watched it happen. He'd watched a lot of things happen in the last 20 minutes that training never prepared him for. The way a man's helmet spun in the air when shrapnel caught him. The sound burning metal makes when rain hits it. The particular silence that falls when everyone realizes the radio is dead and no orders are coming. Christie's breath fogged in the June air. Cold for summer. Cold for Normandy. He wiped mud from the binoculars and looked again. The lead panther was maybe 300 meters out, now advancing slowly, cautiously, with infantry moving in the tree line behind it. Standard German doctrine. Let the tanks draw fire, let the infantry exploit the chaos. It was working. It had been working for days. The Canadians had the numbers, but the Germans had the ground, and in Normandy, that was everything. He noticed something then, a detail that didn't matter except it did. The Panthers were following the road because the fields on either side were cratered from days of shelling. They couldn't risk breaking track in that terrain. They had to stay on the road, which meant they had to pass within 50 meters of the ruined farmhouse where Christie had seen the supply cache that morning, the one marked with engineer tape. The one full of Composition B, charges and detonators that someone had abandoned when the position collapsed. His mind turned the problem over, slow and methodical the way he always thought. Too slow, his sergeant used to say. You think too much, Christie, but his sergeant was dead now and thinking was all Christie had left. 200 meters of open ground between him and that farmhouse. Machine gun coverage from at least 2 positions. German infantry advancing, 4, maybe 5 Panthers with supporting elements. And somewhere in that ruined barn, enough explosives to stop a tank if you knew how to use them, if you could reach them, if you had time. He looked back at his platoon, 18 men when they started the assault. Maybe 12 now. Some wounded, some dead, some just frozen in the mud waiting for orders that would never come. He could see their faces, young faces mostly, kids from Toronto and Montreal and Saskatchewan farms who'd never seen anything like this. They were looking at him, not for orders, just looking, the way drowning men look at anything that might float. Christie stood up. It wasn't courage that made him move. It was the realization that waiting meant extinction, that in the algebra of survival 0 multiplied by caution still equals 0. He slung his rifle, checked his ammunition, and felt in his pocket for the small notebook where he kept blast radius calculations. A stupid habit. Obsessive, really. But he'd always been that way. Even as a kid in Saskatchewan, taking apart tractors to see how they worked, timing how long it took dynamite to clear a stump, his father called it a waste of time. His training sergeant called it a gift. In the next 3 minutes, Corporal Albert Christie would use that gift to change the rhythm of an entire battle. But first he had to cross 200 meters of ground that every tactical manual said was impossible to cross alive. He began to run, The first 30 meters were the worst. Machine gun fire kicked up mud to his left, stitched a line across the ground where he'd been standing 2 seconds earlier. Christie didn't look back. Looking back meant thinking, and thinking meant stopping, and stopping meant dying. He ran in a crouch, zigzagging between shell craters, using every depression in the ground for cover. His lungs burned. His equipment rattled. Somewhere behind him, a man shouted his name, but the wind took it. He made it to the farmhouse in 40 seconds that felt like 40 minutes. Threw himself against the stone wall, chest heaving, and checked for wounds he couldn't feel yet. Nothing. Miraculous and impossible, but nothing. The building was half collapsed, one wall blown out by artillery, roof timbers exposed like ribs. He could see the cache from here. Green wooden crate with engineer markings partially buried under rubble near what used to be a doorway. The tape was still visible, yellow and black, explosives, handle with care. Christie crawled inside and began pulling at the debris. But to understand why this moment mattered, why one corporal's desperate gamble would ripple through the entire Canadian advance, you had to go back. Back to June 6th, 1944, when the world held its breath and 20,000 young men crossed the English Channel into the largest amphibious assault in human history. Back to the beaches where blood turned the surf pink and men died before they reached dry sand. Back to the moment when military planners realized that taking the beach was just the beginning. The real war started inland. The Canadians landed at Juno Beach. They fought through coastal defenses, pushed inland faster than almost any other unit on D-Day, took their objectives with casualties that seemed acceptable only because the alternative was unthinkable. 14,000 men went ashore that morning. By nightfall, 359 were dead, over 700 wounded. But they held the beach. They held the villages beyond it. And when High Command issued the order to advance on Caen, the key city of Normandy, the strategic linchpin that would unlock the entire region, the Canadians moved forward without hesitation. They didn't know they were walking into a killing ground. Caen sat 12 kilometers inland from the beaches, 12 kilometers that might as well have been 1,200. The Germans knew what Caen meant. They knew that whoever controlled that city controlled the roads to Paris, controlled the supply lines that fed the entire Norman front, controlled the high ground that dominated the coastal plain. So they dug in. The 12th SS Panzer Division, the Hitler-Jugend fanatics, barely older than the boys they were killing, took positions in the hedgerows and tree lines and medieval stone walls that turned every field into a fortress. The Canadians advanced into that maze and bled. Every assault stalled in mud and fire. Every push forward cost men and tanks and time they didn't have. The German panzers used the terrain like a weapon. They positioned themselves on slight elevations, invisible to aerial reconnaissance, hull down behind hedgerows where only their turrets showed, and they waited. When Canadian infantry moved forward, the 88mm guns opened up. When Canadian tanks tried to support German infantry, with Panzerfausts emerged from ditches and tree lines. It was a perfect killing system. Methodical and ruthless, and it worked. By June 8th, 2 days before Christie would make his run, Canadian casualties had reached 2,800. 2,800 men dead, wounded or missing in fields whose names they'd never heard before and would never forget. Puteaux-en-Bessin, Bretteville-Orgueilleuse, Le Mesnil-Patry. Villages that existed as dots on maps and nightmares in memory. The advance that was supposed to take 3 days had stalled completely. Allied High Command sent reconnaissance aircraft, but the weather turned them back. They sent artillery barrages, but without clear targeting, the shells fell on empty fields while the panzers waited in cover. They sent more infantry, more tanks, more orders to push harder, faster, break through at any cost. The cost kept rising. The Canadians had the numbers. They had air superiority when the weather cleared. They had naval gunfire support when targets could be identified. But the Germans had the ground, and in Normandy, that was everything. The hedgerows were 800 years old, grown thick as fortress walls, roots deep enough to stop tank treads. The fields between them were cratered from days of shelling impassable to armor deadly to infantry crossing in the open. German observers in church steeples called down artillery with precision that seemed supernatural. Panzer commanders positioned their tanks at choke points where one well-placed 88 could hold back an entire company. Reports from division headquarters showed the frustration in stark language. Advance impossible without armor support. Armor support cannot move without infantry. Infantry taking unacceptable casualties without air cover. Air cover grounded by weather. Request permission to consolidate and regroup. Permission denied. Orders remain, take con. It was a perfect stalemate. The kind that swallows armies. The kind that turns strategic objectives into graveyards and fills casualty reports with numbers that stop meaning anything because the mind can't hold them. Every commander from Montgomery down knew they had to break it. Every soldier in the line knew they were the ones who would pay for breaking it. And somewhere in that storm of confusion and blood and impossible orders in the shattered village of Mesnil-Patry, on the morning of June 9th, one corporal with a head full of demolition theory and a pocket full of blast radius, calculations would find a way to break the equation. Not with more men, not with better tactics, but with one act of calculated madness that every manual said was suicide and every instinct said was necessary. Christie pulled the wooden crate free from the rubble. The lid was cracked, but the contents were intact. Composition B, charges cylindrical blocks wrapped in waxed paper, each one marked with weight and detonation specifications. Blasting caps in a separate compartment. Wire, fuse, everything you needed to bring down a building or clear an obstacle or stop a tank if you knew what you were doing. Christie knew what he was doing. He'd been preparing for this moment without knowing it for 2 years. Albert Christie was 25 years old. Born in Saskatchewan, 1919, a year after the last war ended and 2 decades before this one began. His father farmed wheat on land so flat you could see weather coming from 3 horizons away. His mother taught school in a one-room building where 15 children learned everything from arithmetic to history on benches their grandfathers built. Christie grew up in that landscape of silence and distance where machinery mattered more than words and a man's value showed in what he could fix. He wasn't the loudest, wasn't the bravest, wasn't the kind of boy who started fights or led expeditions into the coulees looking for adventure. He was the one who stayed behind after threshing to take apart the separator and understand why it jammed. The one who timed how long dynamite took to clear a stump, not because anyone asked, but because the question interested him. His father called it a waste of time. You think too much, Albert, just do the work. But Christie couldn't stop thinking. His mind turned problems over the way water turns a stone, steady and patient and relentless. At 17, he rebuilt a tractor engine that 3 mechanics said was finished. At 19, he rigged a windmill to pump water twice as fast, using counterweights and timing he calculated on scrap paper. At 21, when conscription came and Canada needed bodies for a war across an ocean, Christie enlisted without hesitation, not from patriotism exactly, not from duty or glory or any of the reasons they put on recruiting posters. He enlisted because staying home meant watching other men leave, and something in him couldn't accept that mathematics. The army wanted infantry. Christie wanted engineers. They compromised. He went to the Queen's Own Rifles but volunteered for every demolitions course, every explosives training session, every opportunity to work with charges and fuses, and the physics of controlled destruction. His sergeant noticed. You got a knack for this, Christie. Most men afraid of explosives. You respect them? Christie didn't know how to explain that fear and respect were the same thing that understanding blast radius and fragmentation patterns made him less afraid, not more. He just kept taking notes in a small pocket notebook, recording charge weights and detonation velocities and the angles that directed force most efficiently. In England, during the long months of training before D-Day, Christie built devices nobody asked for. Shaped charges that focused explosive force in specific directions, daisy-chain detonations that could collapse multiple structures in sequence. His commanding officer found him one afternoon behind the barracks with wire and blasting caps spread across a workbench testing patterns. "What are you doing, Corporal? Figuring out how to stop a tank with field-expedient materials, sir?" The officer stared at him. "You planning on stopping a lot of tanks?" Christie looked up from his calculations. "I don't know, sir. Seemed worth knowing just in case." The other men thought he was strange. Too quiet, too obsessed with details that didn't matter until suddenly they did. But they trusted him the way soldiers trust anyone who knows their craft completely. When they needed a door blown, they called Christie. When they needed a bridge dropped, Christie calculated the charges. When they needed to clear a minefield faster than doctrine allowed, Christie found a way. He didn't talk much, didn't joke or gamble or tell stories around the fire. He just worked methodical and precise building expertise in 3-second increments that would someday add up to survival. June 6th came, the landing, the beach, the chaos that no training could prepare for. Christie went ashore with the third wave at Juno Beach and discovered that war was nothing like the manuals. It was faster and louder and more random than any theory predicted. Men died from mathematics you couldn't calculate. Shrapnel found angles that shouldn't exist. Artillery fell on coordinates that were supposed to be safe. But Christie adapted. He always adapted. That's what thinking too much gave you. The ability to revise your understanding when reality disagreed with theory. In the days after D-Day, pushing inland through hedgerows and villages whose names he couldn't pronounce, Christie kept taking notes. Blast patterns in different soil conditions. How German 88mm rounds fragmented compared to Allied shells. The effective range of a Panzerfaust and the angle at which German tank armor was most vulnerable. Information that seemed useless until it wasn't. Data points that accumulated in his notebook and his memory, waiting for the moment when they would matter. His platoon sergeant noticed the notebook once. "What's all this Christie blast calculation, Sergeant? Radii and velocities and deflection angles." The sergeant flipped through pages of diagrams and numbers. "You think you're going to blow up a tank or yourself one of these days?" Christie smiled, rare for him. "Maybe both, Sergeant, maybe both." Now, crouched in a ruined farmhouse with German Panthers advancing and his platoon dying in a ditch 200 meters away, Christie opened that notebook to a page he'd marked 3 weeks earlier. Composition B-shaped charge optimal standoff distance for track disruption. The calculations were theoretical. He'd never tested them in combat, never had the opportunity or the desperation, but the numbers were sound. The physics worked. And in the next 10 minutes, Corporal Albert Christie would prove that sometimes the difference between theory and practice is just courage. Quiet courage. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that grows in the silence of Saskatchewan fields and manifests in the chaos of Norman hedgerows when every other option has failed. He began pulling charges from the crate. His hands were steady now, not because fear had left, because purpose had arrived. And for men like Christie, men who lived in their heads and found certainty in mathematics, purpose was stronger than fear. The charges were heavier than he remembered. 8 cylindrical blocks, each one weighing 2 pounds, wrapped in waxed paper that was damp from the rain that had stopped hours ago, but left everything wet. Christie laid them out on the stone floor in a pattern only he understood, blasting caps next. Wire. He had maybe 30 meters of field telephone wire in the crate, thin copper strand that the engineers used for communications, but worked just as well for detonation chains if you understood the principles. He understood the principles. Outside, the Panthers were closer. He could hear them now without listening. The mechanical growl of engines designed in Stuttgart and built by slave labor in factories that Allied bombers couldn't reach. The squeal of road wheels on metal track. The particular sound steel makes grinding through mud and gravel. 200 meters, maybe less. Moving slow, because doctrine said move slow when infantry might be present, when the terrain was uncertain, when ambush was possible. Christie worked faster. The afternoon of June 9th had started with optimism. Not much, just enough. The Canadian 3rd Division received orders to push toward the village of Mesnil-Patry, secure the crossroads, establish positions that would threaten German supply lines running south from Caen. Intelligence said the defenses were light. Reconnaissance photos 3 days old because of weather showed minimal armor presence. The attack went forward at 1,300 hours. 14 Sherman tanks, 3 companies of infantry artillery support from positions 2 kilometers back. Standard assault doctrine. Overwhelming force applied to a narrow front. They made it 400 meters before the world exploded. German 88mm guns opened up from positions intelligence said didn't exist. The first 3 Shermans died in 10 seconds. Direct hits, turret penetrations, ammunition detonations that sent metal fragments spinning through the air like horizontal rain. The Canadian tanks tried to maneuver, tried to identify targets, tried to return fire at enemies they couldn't see. 4 more Shermans burned, then 6, then 9. The infantry dismounted and ran for cover that wasn't there. Machine gun fire from the tree line cut them down in the open. Mortar rounds walked across the field in methodical patterns. Artillery fell with precision that suggested German observers had perfect sight lines and all the time in the world. Within 15 minutes, 13 of 14 Shermans were destroyed or immobilized. The infantry companies that went forward with 300 men, scattered into crater groups of 6 or 8, pinned down by interlocking fire, cut off from support, unable to advance or retreat. The radio net went silent. Not jammed, just dead. German counter-battery fire had found the Canadian command post and turned it into shattered equipment and bodies. Christie's platoon made it to a drainage ditch west of the killing ground. 18 men when the assault started, 12 when they reached cover. Sergeant Mackenzie took shrapnel in the chest and died before anyone could apply a bandage. Lieutenant Morrison caught machine gun fire across both legs. 2 privates dragged him into a crater and held pressure on wounds that wouldn't stop bleeding. The platoon medic was somewhere in the field, dead or dying, or too far away to help. Christie pressed himself into the mud at the bottom of the ditch and tried to think, tried to calculate, tried to find the equation that resulted in survival instead of extinction. The mathematics kept coming back negative. No radio, no support, no orders, German armor advancing, infantry following. Artillery still falling in methodical patterns that would eventually walk across their position. Time measured in minutes, maybe less. He looked at the men around him, young faces mud-streaked and pale, a private from Toronto who couldn't stop shaking, a lance corporal from Montreal who kept repeating the Lord's Prayer in French, a farm boy from Alberta who'd been laughing about something an hour ago and now stared at nothing with eyes that didn't blink. They weren't looking at Christie for orders. They were just looking the way animals look when the trap closes, aware but helpless, conscious that the world is ending but unable to imagine what comes next. Christie felt something break inside him. Not courage rising, not heroism manifesting, something simpler and more brutal. The realization that waiting meant death. That every tactical manual and every rule of engagement and every instinct for self-preservation was designed for situations that still had solutions, and this situation had no solutions except the ones you created yourself. He remembered the supply cache, the ruined farmhouse 200 meters forward, the explosives marked with engineer tape that he'd noticed that morning when they moved through. His mind had cataloged it automatically, the way it cataloged everything. Green crate, composition B. Enough to collapse a building or crater, a road, or stop a tank if you positioned it correctly. If you understood blast physics. If you had the time and materials and knowledge to turn theory into practice. 200 meters of open ground, machine gun coverage from multiple angles. German infantry advancing. Every manual said crossing that ground was suicide. Every instinct said stay down, stay hidden, wait for rescue that wasn't coming. Every rational calculation said the odds were impossible. But Christie had stopped calculating odds. He was calculating blast radii now. Charge placement, detonation sequence, the angle at which a shaped explosion could disable a Panther's track, the standoff distance needed for maximum effect. His notebook was in his pocket. His knowledge was in his head. The explosives were in that farmhouse waiting for someone crazy enough to use them. He looked back one more time at the men in the ditch, at the wounded lieutenant who would die without medical evacuation, at the private who'd stopped shaking and started crying silently, at the burned-out Shermans still cooking off ammunition, at the German Panthers rolling closer through the smoke and morning mist, patient and methodical, following doctrine that worked because nobody challenged it. It wasn't courage that made him move. Courage suggested choice, nobility, moral calculation. This was simpler, more desperate, the arithmetic of extinction. 0 minus 0 equals 0. But movement, however small, however insane, created the possibility of non-zero. And possibility, however remote, was more than they had staying still. Christie checked his rifle, checked his ammunition, felt for the notebook one more time. Then he stood up from the ditch and began to run, against every rule, against every instinct, against every calculation that rational men use to navigate war. He chose motion, 200 meters through machine gun fire, toward a building that might contain salvation or might contain nothing but another way to die. His boots hit mud, his breath came hard, artillery whistled overhead, and behind him in the ditch 12 men watched and wondered if they were seeing courage or madness, or if in war those two things were the same. The first 30 meters were the worst. Machine gun fire kicked up mud to his left, stitched a line across the ground where he'd been standing 2 seconds earlier. Christie didn't look back. Looking back meant thinking, and thinking meant stopping, and stopping meant dying. He ran in a crouch, zigzagging between shell craters, using every depression in the ground for cover. His lungs burned. His equipment rattled. Somewhere behind him, a man shouted his name, but the wind took it. 50 meters. A mortar round landed close enough to throw him sideways into a crater. He hit the slope hard, tasted blood, rolled to the bottom, and kept moving. The ground shook with artillery. Smoke drifted thick across the field. German voices shouted in the tree line, calling corrections, directing fire. The Panthers were closer now. He could hear the engines clearly. That deep mechanical growl that meant 60 tons of steel and high-velocity cannon closing distance. 100 meters. His right leg went numb. Not pain, just absence. He looked down, saw shrapnel, had torn through his trousers, but missed the artery. Blood soaked through the fabric, but he was still moving, still functional. That was all that mattered. Function. Movement. Reaching the farmhouse before the Panthers reached the road. 150 meters. Machine gun fire found him again. Rounds snapped past his head with that particular crack that meant close, too close inches instead of feet. He dove behind a burned-out Jeep and pressed his face into the mud and counted 3 seconds before moving again. Training said count to 10. Instinct said 3 seconds was all he had. 200 meters. He hit the farmhouse wall and collapsed against it, chest heaving, vision blurred. His hands shook. His legs screamed now that adrenaline was fading. He checked for wounds he couldn't feel, found the shrapnel tear, applied pressure with his palm. Not serious, not immediately fatal. He'd live long enough to finish what he started or die trying. The crate was where he remembered. Green wood, engineer markings, yellow and black tape. He pulled charges from the box and counted. 8 blocks. Enough. More than enough if he positioned them correctly. Blasting caps in a separate compartment, each one wrapped in protective cloth. Wire. 30 meters of copper strand. A firing plunger that looked like something from a mining operation, spring-loaded, designed for one purpose. Christie's mind shifted into the space where calculation lived, where fear couldn't reach because numbers were happening. He had the charges, he had the detonators, he had wire and a basic understanding of Panther tank construction from intelligence briefs he'd memorized without knowing why. Track vulnerability, suspension points, the relationship between explosive force and directional placement. He began building. The charges linked together like Christmas lights, each one wired to the next in a daisy chain pattern that would detonate in sequence, creating a rolling explosion along the length of the road. Christie positioned them in the drainage ditch that paralleled the track, spacing them 3 meters apart, burying them just deep enough that passing infantry wouldn't notice, but shallow enough that the blast would direct upward, toward the road, toward where tank treads would be. His hands worked automatically. Muscle memory from training, insert blasting cap, crimp connector, run wire to next charge. His mind was already 3 steps ahead, calculating detonation, velocity, blast radius, the angle at which force would travel through mud versus gravel. The Panthers were following the road because the fields were cratered. They had to stay on hardpack, which meant they had to pass directly over his improvised minefield. Theory meeting practice, mathematics becoming reality. The lead Panther appeared through the smoke, 200 meters out, moving slow, turret traversing left and right, scanning for targets. Infantry, behind it 20 or 30 men in the standard dispersed formation, Mauser rifles at ready. Christie could see the commander in the cupola binoculars raised, directing the advance with hand signals. 150 meters. Christie primed the firing plunger. His hands were steady now, completely steady. Fear had burned away and left only purpose. The kind of clarity that comes when calculation replaces emotion, when the problem narrows to a single question with a binary answer. Detonate now or wait. Too early and the blast misses. Too late and the opportunity passes. He watched the lead Panther roll forward, counted distance in heartbeats, estimated speed against ground covered, applied the formula he'd worked out 3 weeks ago in his notebook. Optimal standoff for track disruption 12 meters. Detonation sequence 0.3 seconds between charges. Total blast duration 2.4 seconds. Window of opportunity 3 seconds maximum, 100 meters. German infantry passed within 50 meters of his position. He pressed himself flat against the inside wall of the ruined farmhouse and didn't breathe. Boots crunching gravel, equipment rattling, voices speaking German he couldn't understand but recognized as operational chatter. Advance, secure, eliminate resistance, 75 meters. The Panther's engine note changed, shifting gears, accelerating slightly on the straightaway. 50 tons of armor moving at maybe 15 kilometers per hour. track plates gripping the road surface. Christie's eyes tracked the lead road wheel, calculated its position against the buried charges, ran the mathematics one final time. 50 meters. Radio static crackled somewhere. German artillery paused. In the sudden quiet, Christie could hear everything. The squeal of the Panther's tracks, the commander shouting orders, his own heartbeat in his ears, the weight of the firing plunger in his hand. 30 meters. The lead Panther's front track plate aligned with the first charge. Christie slammed the plunger. The ground convulsed. The first charge detonated with a sound that wasn't sound, more pressure than noise, a physical wave that compressed air and earth and everything between. The second charge fired 0.3 seconds later, then the third, fourth, fifth, a rolling thunder that ran the length of the road like God dragging his knuckles across creation. Dirt and fire and steel fragments mushroomed upward. The lead Panther lifted just slightly, just enough its left track shearing at the sprocket. The second charge caught it mid-suspension. The third caught the Panther behind it. Smoke rolled across the hedgerow, black and dense and shot through with orange flame. The concussion wave hit Christie and threw him against the farmhouse wall. His ears rang. His vision whited out. He tasted copper and cordite. When he could see again, the lead Panther sat motionless, track blown completely off hull, slewed sideways across the road. The second Panther had reversed hard and collided with the third. German infantry were scattered across the field, diving for cover, shouting in confusion. They thought they'd hit a minefield, thought they'd driven into prepared defenses, thought the Canadians had engineering support and deliberate obstacle placement and coordinated killing zones. They didn't know it was one corporal with a crate of explosives and 3 weeks of theory converted to practice in 10 minutes of desperation. The German column halted, completely stopped. Officers shouted orders. Infantry pulled back to defensive positions. The Panthers that could move reversed away from the blast zone. Standard doctrine when encountering mines: consolidate, assess. Call for engineers. Don't advance until the threat is cleared. Christie crawled out of the farmhouse and started back toward his platoon. His leg didn't work right anymore. Blood loss or nerve damage or shock, he didn't know. He crawled most of the way, heard Canadian voices shouting, saw movement in the ditch where his unit was pinned. The German machine gun fire had stopped. The artillery had shifted to defensive positions. The pressure that had been crushing them for the last hour lifted. Someone grabbed him, dragged him the last 20 meters. He couldn't hear what they were saying, couldn't hear anything except ringing. But he could see their faces: disbelief, wonder, relief. The lance corporal from Montreal was crying. The private from Toronto was laughing. The wounded lieutenant was conscious being bandaged would survive to fight again. In less than 10 seconds, one improvised idea had shattered a day's worth of German momentum. One corporal who thought too much and calculated blast radii in a notebook had found the equation nobody else saw. The answer wasn't in the manual, wasn't in training. It was in the space between theory and necessity, where mathematics met desperation and produced something that looked like miracle, but was really just applied knowledge converted to action at exactly the right moment. But the real miracle wasn't that it worked once, it was how fast it spread. Christie came to in the drainage ditch, with someone pressing a canteen to his lips. The water tasted like metal and iodine and life. His ears still rang, but sound was returning in pieces, voices, movement, the distant crack of small arms fire. He tried to sit up and hands pushed him back down. "Easy, Corporal. You're bleeding pretty good." The medic worked on his leg with practiced efficiency. Sulfa powder, bandage, pressure. Christie watched without feeling it. His mind was somewhere else, still calculating, still running the numbers on what just happened. The German advance had stopped, completely stopped. Through the smoke, Christie could see the lead Panther sitting motionless on the road track blown off, hull slewed at an angle that blocked the entire route. The second Panther had reversed back around the curve. German infantry had pulled into defensive positions in the tree line, no longer advancing, no longer pressing. The machine gun fire that had pinned them for an hour was silent. The artillery had shifted away, falling on suspected Canadian positions 200 meters back. Captain Williamson found him 20 minutes later. The company commander looked like he'd aged a decade in an afternoon, mud-streaked, exhausted, but alive. He crouched beside Christie and stared at him for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, "What the hell did you do?" Corporal Christie tried to explain. "The cache, the charges, the daisy chain detonation." the blast radius calculations. It came out, fragmented, and incomplete words interrupted by ringing in his ears, and the particular exhaustion that comes after adrenaline burns away. Williamson listened, didn't interrupt. When Christie finished, the captain looked toward the burning Panthers and shook his head slowly. You blew 2 German tanks with field-expedient explosives. It wasn't a question, just a statement of fact that needed saying out loud to become real. 3, sir, the lance corporal from Montreal said. 3rd one threw a track when it reversed. Crew abandoned it. Williamson turned back to Christie. You crossed 200 meters of open ground under machine gun fire to reach an unsecured supply cache, built an improvised minefield using materials you weren't authorized to access, and stopped an armored advance without orders or support. He paused. That's either the bravest thing I've seen or the stupidest. Both, sir, Christie said. Probably both. The captain almost smiled. Can you walk? Not well, sir. Then you're staying here. I need to report this up the chain before someone decides to court-martial you for unauthorized use of explosives. He stood, looked at the disabled Panthers one more time, or before they give you a medal. I genuinely don't know which. The report went up within the hour. Captain Williamson to battalion, battalion to brigade, brigade to division engineers. The language was careful, clinical. Corporal Christie improvised anti-tank obstacle using available materials. Result: 3 enemy tanks disabled, advance halted, unit casualties minimized. Recommend immediate engineering assessment of technique for broader application. Division engineers arrived the next morning. 2 officers and a sergeant with technical training and skeptical expressions. They inspected the blast site, measured crater depth, examined the disabled Panther's track assembly, photographed the positioning, interviewed Christie, who explained his calculations while sitting on a crate because his leg wouldn't support extended standing. The senior engineer, a major from Toronto, asked detailed questions: charge spacing, detonation sequence, blast direction. Christie answered each one from memory. The major took notes. Where did you learn shaped charge theory? Training, sir. And experimentation. Experimentation. In England, sir, during preparations. I built test patterns to understand directional blast effects. The major exchanged looks with his colleague. You taught yourself advanced demolition theory. Yes, sir. Seemed useful. It was useful, Corporal. It was also completely outside standard doctrine. The major closed his notebook, which means we're either going to replicate it or forbid it. Probably replicate it. Can you teach the method? Christie thought about that. About blast radii and charge placement and the specific calculations that turned theory into disabled German armor. Yes, sir, if you have wire and explosives and men willing to listen. Within 48 hours, Christie conducted 3 training sessions. Small groups of engineers and infantry NCOs. He used diagrams drawn in mud, demonstrated wire connections on dummy charges, explained the mathematics without overwhelming them with theory. Keep it simple. Charges every 3 meters. Bury them shallow. Detonate when the lead track plate reaches the first position. The blast will travel faster than the tank can react. A sergeant from the Canadian Scottish asked the question everyone was thinking. What if it doesn't work? Then you die, Christie said. But you were probably going to die anyway. This gives you better odds. The training spread, squad by squad, platoon by platoon. Engineers began carrying wire and charges as standard equipment. Infantry NCOs memorized blast radius charts. Within a week, 3 other units reported successful anti-tank ambushes using Christie's method, modified, adapted, but fundamentally his daisy chain detonations, field expedient obstacles, one man with knowledge turning available materials into tactical advantage. The technique had a name by mid-June. Christie mines, some called them. Improvised track traps, said others. The official designation was field expedient directional anti-tank obstacles. But every soldier who used them knew the real name. They knew who figured it out first, who crossed open ground under fire to prove it worked, who taught the method without asking for recognition or credit or anything except the satisfaction of knowing fewer men would die for ground they had to take anyway. For the first time in days, the Canadians advanced, not because of superior numbers, not because of better equipment, because one corporal refused to wait for orders that wouldn't come, because he thought too much and calculated too long, and turned obsession into innovation at exactly the moment when innovation meant survival. The fields around Mesnil-Patry stayed quiet for 3 days. Then the Canadians moved forward again toward Caen, toward objectives they'd been bleeding for since D-Day. This time, when German armor appeared, they had answers. Improvised answers, dangerous answers. But answers. By June 14th, 5 days after Christie blew the first Panther track, 14 separate Canadian units had deployed variants of his method. The reports came in with clinical language that couldn't hide the significance. Field expedient obstacles successful against armor at grid reference. Enemy advance delayed by improvised demolitions at. Casualties minimized through application of new anti-tank technique. The words changed, but the pattern held. One man's desperate calculation was becoming doctrine. The technique spread because it worked, because it required materials every unit already carried, because it could be taught in 20 minutes to anyone who understood basic demolition principles: wire, charges, detonator. Bury them shallow in a line perpendicular to enemy advance. Wait until armor commits to the road. Fire the plunger. The simplicity was elegant. The effectiveness was undeniable. But more than that, it spread because it gave infantry something they desperately needed: agency, control, a way to fight back against armor that had dominated them since D-Day. German Panthers and Tigers had created a psychological effect beyond their tactical value. Soldiers heard the engine note and knew what came next: helplessness, retreat, death. Christie's method didn't eliminate that fear, but it transformed it, turned passive victims into active threats, gave riflemen the ability to destroy machines that outweighed them 50-1. The Canadian 3rd Division's advance toward Carpiquet Airfield on June 18th demonstrated the operational impact. The airfield sat 3 kilometers west of Caen, a strategic position that controlled approaches to the city. German defenders included elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division, positioned in depth using the same tactics that had bled the Canadians for 2 weeks. Armor in hull-down positions, infantry in prepared defenses, interlocking fields of fire that turned every advance into a killing ground. The Canadian assault plan incorporated Christie's innovation as standard procedure. Engineer teams positioned improvised explosive obstacles on 3 separate approach roads. Infantry carried wire and charges as routine equipment. When German armor counterattacked from concealed positions, expecting to roll over disorganized infantry, they hit prepared detonations instead. 4 Panthers disabled in the first hour. 2 more mobility killed trying to maneuver around the obstacles. The counterattack stalled. The Canadian infantry held. The airfield fell within 36 hours. The after-action report noted the tactical shift with understated precision. Employment of field-expedient anti-tank obstacles resulted in successful defense against armored counterattack. Recommend continued application of technique across division front. But the soldiers who fought there understood what the clinical language meant. They'd stopped a panzer counterattack with explosives and wire. They'd held ground that doctrine said they couldn't hold. They'd won because one corporal taught them how. The strategic consequences rippled outward. German commanders along the Normandy front began factoring the new threat into their planning. Armor advances became more cautious, reconnaissance more thorough. The psychological advantage they'd held since June 6th eroded incrementally but definitively. Allied intelligence intercepts captured the shift. German radio traffic mentioned Canadian demolition capabilities with new respect. Obstacle density higher than anticipated. Advance routes compromised by improvised mining. Recommend engineering support before armor commitment. The 12th SS Panzer Division's operational logs for late June showed the impact in stark numbers. Average daily advance before June 9th, 4 kilometers. Average daily advance after June 20th, 1.7 kilometers. The difference wasn't Allied air superiority or artillery superiority or numerical advantage. The difference was that Canadian infantry could now stop German armor with materials they carried in their packs and knowledge one corporal shared without asking for recognition. Christie himself saw none of this firsthand. On June 22nd, during a German artillery barrage near Carpiquet, shrapnel caught him across the right shoulder and chest. Not immediately fatal, but serious enough for evacuation. They loaded him onto an ambulance, drove him to the beach, transferred him to a landing craft that crossed the channel through morning fog. England by nightfall, hospital by midnight, surgery the next morning. He recovered in a military hospital outside Portsmouth, sharing a ward with 30 other wounded soldiers who told stories about things they'd seen and done and survived. Christie didn't tell stories. He answered questions when doctors asked them, accepted medication when nurses provided it, slept when exhaustion allowed, and stared at the ceiling when it didn't. The shrapnel wounds healed. The damage to his hearing remained permanent. The memories didn't fade, but they became manageable, filed away in the same mental space where he kept blast radius calculations and charge placement diagrams. The citation came in August, mentioned in dispatches. The official language was spare, for gallantry and devotion to duty during operations in Normandy. The unofficial story spread through the Canadian Army faster than any dispatch. The corporal who stopped the Panthers, the Saskatchewan farm boy who rewrote demolition doctrine with wire and desperation, the man who thought too much and calculated too long and turned obsession into innovation when innovation meant survival. Christie never considered himself a hero. When reporters found him after the war, tried to interview him about what happened at Mesnil-Patry, he answered questions with the same methodical precision he'd used for blast calculations. Someone had to do something, he said. The explosives were there. The knowledge was there. The necessity was there. I just connected them. The reporters wanted more. Wanted drama, emotion, the language of heroism. Christie gave them mathematics, charge weight, standoff distance, detonation, velocity. The reporters stopped asking questions. But history remembers what Christie couldn't articulate. Remembers that battles turn on moments when one person refuses to accept the equation everyone else considers inevitable. That innovation comes not from planning committees or doctrine manuals, but from desperation, meeting knowledge in circumstances where failure means extinction. That the difference between defeat and survival sometimes measures exactly the distance one man will run under fire to reach a crate of explosives and 30 meters of copper wire. The fields around Mesnil-Patry fell quiet by July. The Canadians moved forward. Caen finally fell after weeks of fighting that consumed battalions and left the medieval city in ruins. The war continued. Men died, ground changed hands. The great machinery of Allied advance rolled eastward toward Germany and ultimate victory. Christie's contribution became a footnote, one tactic among thousands. One innovation in a war that demanded constant adaptation, but the soldiers who learned his method remembered. The engineers who taught it remembered. The men who survived Panzer counterattacks because they knew how to daisy-chain explosives and wait for the right moment to press a plunger they remembered. Not his name always. Not the specific details, but the principle. The knowledge that helplessness is temporary, that innovation beats doctrine, that one person thinking clearly in chaos can change the outcome for everyone. 80 years later, the fields where Corporal Albert Christie made his run are silent. Grass grows where fire once burned. Hedgerows that witnessed killing stand thick and green under Norman sun. Tourists drive past on roads that trace the same routes German Panthers followed in June 1944. Few stop. Fewer still know what happened here. The village of Mesnil-Patry rebuilt itself after the war. Stone walls replaced, roofs restored. Life continued with the particular stubbornness of places that refuse to be defined by their worst days. The only traces of Christie's gamble lie beneath the soil. Fragments of wire, rusted steel, blast patterns that Earth has absorbed and covered and made invisible to everyone except archaeologists with metal detectors and patience. The drainage ditch where he positioned his charges is still there, overgrown now, filled with wildflowers in spring and standing water in winter. A historical marker stands at the crossroads, brass plaque. 3 languages. The text mentions Canadian sacrifice and German resistance and the strategic importance of the advance toward Caen. It does not mention Christie. Does not mention the farmhouse or the explosives or the 200 meters he crossed under fire, because waiting meant extinction. History forgets the details, remembers the outcomes. The Canadian 3rd Division took Caen eventually. Took it with casualties that fill entire volumes of war records. Took it because thousands of men like Christie made calculations under impossible pressure and chose motion over paralysis. The great machinery of Allied victory rolled forward through France, through Belgium, through Germany itself. Generals planned, politicians negotiated. History books recorded the campaigns and strategies and turning points that seemed inevitable in retrospect, but felt anything but inevitable to the men who lived them. But war does not turn on inevitability. It turns on moments, small moments, unrepeatable moments. The instant when one person looks at an impossible situation and refuses to accept the mathematics everyone else considers final. The 3 seconds between recognizing necessity and acting on it. The space where knowledge meets desperation and produces something that looks like miracle, but is really just applied intelligence converted to motion at exactly the right instant. Christie understood that instinctively. Understood that problems have solutions if you stop asking permission and start calculating angles. That theory becomes practice when circumstances eliminate every option except the ones you create yourself. That the difference between survival and extinction sometimes measures exactly the distance between where you are and where explosives wait for someone brave enough, or desperate enough, or crazy enough to use them. He never called it courage. When asked about it later, decades later, in the quiet years when memory replaced immediacy, Christie said only that someone had to do something, that the situation required action, that the knowledge was there and the materials were there and the necessity was there. I just connected them, he said, like wiring a circuit, like solving an equation. Like any problem where the variables are clear and the solution, however dangerous, presents itself to anyone willing to see it. But history remembers what Christie couldn't articulate. Remembers that victory comes not from command but from courage, not from plans but from moments of madness, calculated madness, the kind that grows in the silence of Saskatchewan fields and manifests in Norman hedgerows when every regulation says stop and every instinct says move, the kind that one corporal demonstrated on June 9, 1944, when he stood up from a ditch and ran 200 meters through machine gun fire because the alternative was extinction. Corporal Albert Christie did not win the war, did not change its outcome, did not alter the great strategic arc that bent inevitably toward Allied victory. But for 1 hour on one forgotten road in Normandy, he changed its rhythm, gave infantry a way to fight armor, gave desperate men a template for innovation, gave the Canadian advance momentum when momentum meant everything. The fields are quiet now, the panthers are gone, the smoke has cleared, time has done what time does, covered the scars, softened the edges, made peaceful what was once hell. But beneath the grass, beneath the soil, beneath 80 years of silence, the mathematics remain. Blast radius, charge placement, the distance one man will run when calculation demands it. And somewhere in that equation lies the difference between defeat and survival, between helplessness and action, between the world as it is and the world as one person decides to make it. The wind moves through the hedgerows. Distant thunder rolls across the channel. Ocean waves break on beaches where armies once landed. And history, patient and inexorable, remembers.